Prologue. The halls stank of death, a sour mixture that cobbled together the worst parts of time, neglect, and rot. With every step, he was certain something would spring from the shadows, show its visage in the dim light of the glowing runes on his staff, and then tear his throat out. He was desperate to run, to turn and flee from this strange labyrinth they'd uncovered, but he dared not. Any moment of cowardice would be his last, for one word. Reach the king, there could only be one outcome. Moving carefully past the broken door housed in an ancient arch, he entered a room different from the others he'd encountered so far. It was circular and compact, where everything else had been sprawling. There were accoutrements for living, bookshelves and stove, both long ago ravaged by time. They started to call to him, for he'd been walking over a day now and hunger gnawed at his belly, but then he saw the pedestal. It sat in the center of the room, a dusty white material that might have once gleamed in a different life. Atop it, without any grandeur whatsoever, sat a strange object that reflected the enchanted light from his staff. He moved toward it, and as he did, he felt a strange pulse of magical energy ripple forth. The strange item gleamed now, fully illuminated by the staff's mystical glow. He knew better than to reach out and pick up a clearly enchanted object. Even as a lowly court wizard, that lesson had been beaten into his head by all of his teachers. He did know better, and yet he was still unable to stop himself as his slender elven fingers curled around the object and plucked it from its perch. The glow intensified. No longer was it reflecting his staff's light. Now the object generated illumination of its own. Around him, sounds filled the air as the dungeon began to come alive. Traps rearmed, monsters stirred, and magic poured from every surface. He paid no heed to any of it, however. All he saw, all he could see anymore, was the curious object clutched tightly in his hand. Your party finally makes it into town sometime past midnight. The streets are vacant, save for the occasional guard making rounds, and the only light seems to be emanating from the local tavern. Russell took care. Describing the sleepy hamlet of Maple Bark, determined to get all of the details just right. About freaking time, Mitch grumbled. That took forever. I told you, I want to do more realism in our games. That includes dealing with physical travel time, Russell said, letting out a heavy sigh. Whatever. I say we hit the tavern. Boys, Mitch asked. Hells yeah, Glenn echoed. I'm in, Terry agreed. I'm not sure if paladins are supposed to drink, Tim said quietly. Oh, would you relax? The oath of purity isn't that big of a deal. Besides, you're a level 1 character. If your god abandons you, then just re-roll, Mitch said. We're going to the bar. Fine, Russell said. Roll me vision checks. How does that work again? Tim flipped through the character sheet in front of him, trying to make sense of the various numbers. This was his first time playing spells, swords, and stealth, a tabletop RPG, and there was a lot to remember. You roll the die, in this case a d20, and add your skill bonus. For you, that bonus should be 4. Having helped make Tim's character, Russell was quite familiar with Tim's skills and stats. It was the duty of every game master, or GM as they were informally called, to help the new players get assimilated to the system. If you roll a 20, that's an automatic success and you pull off. Whatever you're trying, if you get a 1, that's a critical failure and you screw it up no matter what your bonus is. Those rules also apply when you're trying to attack someone, only the repercussions are worse. You have to re-roll on a 1, and if it's not above 5, then you hurt yourself. If you ever get 3 1s in a row, your character has failed so badly they accidentally kill themselves. We can do that. Tim's already pale face seemed to lose a few shades. Unbunch your panties. It almost never happens, Mitch said. That's as rare as getting 3 20s in a row, which auto-kills your opponent. Now hurry up and roll. My character's got a thirsty only ale can slake. Once the dice were thrown, and the results had been tabulated, Russell described the scene that met their characters' eyes. You see two humans sitting at the bar. One, a man who appears to be a local guard, and the other, a woman dressed in slightly more noble clothing. Drinking alone at a table in the back is a shadowy figure, small and crooked. You notice him glance at each of you carefully as you walk in. Yeah, he better be scared, right? Sure. Anyway, tending the bar is a half-orc. Once you've all entered, he cocks an eyebrow, Russell said. Oh, he is so trying to start something. Glenn almost giggled. Destructive wizard time. No way. He hasn't provoked us. Can I roll a read motive? Tim asked. He'd finally found the page with his various abilities and was anxious to be of use. Sure, Russell told him. Tim's roll was sufficient, so Russell explained the gesture. You understand this is his way of inquiring what you all want to order. Oh, Tim said. I step up to the bar and say, a round of mead for myself and all my friends, then put a silver piece on the bar. He gives. You back several coppers as change, along with for mead-filled metal mugs. Damn paladin, stopping us from fighting the bartender, Glenn grumbled. I know, I wanted to loot all of his cash, but at least Tim's drinking with us, Terry pointed out. Oh, crap, I forgot. Tim cringed. Is it rude not to drink something I ordered from him? Who cares, he's just an NPC, Mitch said. He turned to Tim, who had already halfway opened his mouth to ask. A question, that means non-player character, someone who doesn't matter. Their background scenery, like the buildings and trees. But you're still drinking the damn mead. Bad enough we have a paladin in the party. If you're a fucking buzzkill too, then we'll stab you in your sleep. You know that would lead to an alignment shift, Mitch, Russell warned him. Whatever, it's not like alignment affects my stats, Mitch countered. Okay, boys. Hoist them mugs. To the quest, echoed the other three players. So, you all toasted with your mead. Does that mean you all drink? Russell asked. Duh, Mitch said. I drained my mug in one sip. The rest of you ingest alcohol, too, I assume? Russell kept probing. Sure, Terry confirmed. Yup, Glenn added. Against my better judgment, yes, I take a deep draw from the mug. Tim sighed. You should trust your judgment more, Tim, Russell said. Behind his screen, he rolled several dice. After what seemed like a very long amount of time rolling, given the fact that nothing had been done other than drink, Russell looked back up at the group. So, let's recap for a moment. Does everyone remember when I warned you this whole week that the new module I bought was going to be more realistic, and that meant accounting for weight, and food, and the like? The other players nodded. Confused looks spreading across their faces. And do you remember how no one bought rations or water when making their characters, so you all wound up starving in the forest earlier? Until yours truly stepped in and found us some food, Mitch declared. You found mushrooms, and you found them when you rolled a critical failure. Didn't you think that was mildly odd? Russell asked. Whatever. It's just a foraging check. Barbarians are made for ass-kicking, not flower-picking, Mitch said. Right, but then you brought the mushrooms back to camp and made a soup that everyone ate. That was about 4 hours ago in game time, giving the mushrooms ample time to digest and enter your system, a system you just introduced alcohol into. You have a point here. Mitch asked. In response, Russell pulled one of his books from behind the screen. It was the module he'd referenced, a pre-made campaign that saved a game master from having to create every detail in the imaginary world, and instead handed him one ready to use. The book was already turned to a page with a picture of a mushroom and several paragraphs about said fungi. Russell handed the book to Mitch. Read the third paragraph. The drunken devil is nickname assigned to this mushroom because of its peculiar effects. It is easily recognized by anyone with the naturalist skill and is therefore avoided due to its danger. While the drunken devil usually only causes sickness and vomiting 6 hours after ingestion, If at any point in the 24 hours following ingestion, the character consumes alcohol, it reacts with the mushroom, causing severe damage and often death, Mitch said, his voice trailing off near the end. Do we get saves? Glenn asked hopefully. I had you make them when you ate the soup. You all failed. And given the damage I just rolled, I'm afraid all of your characters' heads slump over, slamming into the table, Russell said. So we're dead? Tim asked. Yes, you are. Consider this an object lesson in listening when I give you fair warnings about changing up the game style. This is also why I had you make backup characters. I figured you guys might blunder into something like this. There was the sound of shuffling paper as his players produced new character sheets, tossing away the old ones and leaving them forgotten. 2 others, though, the deaths of those for characters were anything but forgettable. Damn, Grumph, you slipping whiskey into the meat again? Gabriel asked as the first strangers dropped their mugs and collapsed onto the table. No, Grumph replied, his half-forked voice like 2 stones scraping together. Then I guess these boys just can't hold their mead, Eric ventured. Adjusting his armor for the umpteenth time that night and taking another sip of ale. Russell hadn't mentioned it, but both Eric and Gabriel were good-looking humans, with Gabriel more of a classic blonde beauty and Eric dark-haired with vibrant eyes. The next voice to speak most certainly did not emanate from an attractive being, though not even by gnome standards. I suppose the proper procedure here is to loot their purses and dump them. Outside, the shadowy-looking gnome said, working his way across the bar. Thistle's black clothes didn't quite conceal the crooks in his bones or the strange gait with which he moved. Thistle, you know I'm a guard. I can't let you loot drunk people randomly, Eric sighed. What if I were to put them in a room? Then removing their gold would simply be them paying for that service. And since they are not awake to haggle, they can hardly complain. Later, if they feel it was a poor deal, once services are rendered, there are no refunds. I'm not sure, Eric wavered. The other option is to toss them in the street. And you know how a vulnerable adventurer draws the monsters, Thistle pointed out. Okay, you win. Just gold, though. Stealing equipment would be going too far, Eric warned. I am fully abreast of general propriety. Gabby, come give me a hand here, Thistle called. Yeah, sure, Gabriel agreed. For the daughter of the local mayor, she was oddly undisturbed by carrying out acts less savory than a proper lady of society should be comfortable with. Hence why she and Thistle had not quite a friendship, but at least a familiarity with one another. Together they went over to the party's table and began removing the gold pouches from the fallen adventurers. Gabriel was on the heavily armored one when she smelled something familiar. It took her a moment to place, but as soon as it registered, she jerked back up to a full standing position and began backing away slowly. Shit, Gabriel swore. What's wrong? Eric asked her, rising to his own feet in concern. They're dead, Gabriel said simply. What do you mean, dead? Eric asked. What do you think I mean? Dead, gone, no longer with us. Passed on, moved on, bugbear food. Are you getting this? But I mean how all they did was walk in and drink Grumph's mead. Eric said that double quotes yes. That's what killed them, Gabriel confirmed. What? Eric shakily drew his sword and turned around to face the half-orc that loomed at least a foot taller than his own thin form. Grumph, why would you poison some innocent adventurers? Way to go there, Lord Shaky of Valiantville. But that's not what I meant, Gabriel clarified. They ate drunken devil in the woods at some point, and then had alcohol. That will kill most people quicker than an axe to the gut. How can you be so sure? Eric asked, the smell coming from their mouths. It's very distinctive. It's one of the deadly plants my parents had a tracker teach me about, since I end up kidnapped in the woods a lot. This was right near the top of the list. They showed me victims as well so I would recognize the symptoms and sense in case it was ever slipped. To me, it's sickly sweet and yeasty. The same smell coming from their open mouths right now, Gabriel explained. This is bad, Eric said, sheathing his sword. I mean, this sure looks like Grumph poisoned them. Oh, don't be such a wench, Gabriel chastised him. It's not that big of a deal. We throw the corpses in the woods and let the monsters take care of the rest. Look at their equipment. These four are nobodies. No priest will be calling their spirits or checking on why they died if they vanish. Easy fix, not quite. I'm afraid, Thistle said, shambling over with a scroll in his hand. I discovered something while scouring their belongings that complicates matters. Great, Eric said. More trouble, that's putting it lightly. According to this writ, these four were on their way to the court in Solium to receive a quest from King Liaden himself, Thistle said. Wait. So they were summoned to appear before the king in order to receive a quest, Gabriel asked. Correct. Which means from the minute they received this scroll, they have technically been emissaries in the employ of the Mad King, the one who was known to burn whole villages at the slightest perceived offense, Thistle confirmed. So, we have 4 corpses in royal employ who are expected in court soon, and who, to an untrained or careless eye, it looks a lot like we've poisoned, Eric said. That about summing it up. Perfectly so, though you could have mentioned that it isn't just royal employ, but royal employ that loathes inconvenience and is more than happy to investigate the death of every person who has failed him in any way in hopes of exacting more torture on them, or at least on the people nearby their corpses, Thistle added. There was a moment of silence, and then the sound of a stony half-forked voice eloquently summarizing the situation in a single syllable. Fuck, too okay, we can handle this. We just have to think. There must be a solution here, Eric rambled, trying desperately and still failing to stay calm. That would depend greatly on your definition of a solution. Technically, the entire town being laid siege to and everyone we know being killed qualifies as a solution. It just isn't a solution that we find. Favorable, Thistle pointed out. Thank you for the cheer, Thistle, Gabriel snapped. We're looking for more constructive feedback. If you don't mind, I'm looking over this scroll, searching for anything we might be able to use to swing the blame off of us. Does that not qualify as constructive? It does, and we greatly appreciate it. We're just trying to think of other options in the event you don't discover anything of use, Eric placated. Now who's the pessimist? Thistle grumbled before turning his attention back to the scroll. Maybe we can still just dump the bodies in the woods, Gabriel ventured. I mean, we're the only ones who know they came through here. If they just die on the way, then the king might swing by, but he wouldn't have any reason to launch a full inquisition. This is less of a the king needs a reason thing and more of a the king loves burning shit and killing people thing, Eric corrected. If we hide the bodies, and if they don't find them, and if they don't manage to use magic to contact the departed souls, then our best case scenario is still royal forces cutting a swath through a huge chunk of land searching for those answers. It happened last harvest, over in Fergr. Why does he keep employing random adventurers who can be so easily killed? Gabrielle wondered, again, because he seems to like leaving a trail of destruction in his wake, Eric reminded her. Right, awesome. Gabriel and the others had heard terms like these from the various adventurers who wandered through their little hamlet from time to time. It struck the townsfolk as curious that these bands of warriors seemed to have a vernacular all their own. But language is infectious, and over time, they had taken to using such slang as well. Some phrases were more popular than others, though, and no one had discerned a standard meaning for the word pronounced as PWN, despite its recent surge in usage. So, the bottom line here is that we're dead, Eric said, a not-so-subtle hint of despair creeping into his voice. If only, Thistle corrected him, That would be far more preferable. Instead, we're looking at the potential death of everyone in town, including friends and family, as well as the burning of our lands and homes to the ground. There was a sound like muted cannons firing as Grumph crackled his knuckles. They'll earn it. Of that, old friend, I have no doubt, Thistle agreed. But while you lot were bemoaning your fate, I discovered something fascinating about the quest this scroll charges them with. Please let it be something good, Eric said. Not on its own, no. It is simply what it is. There is potential in how it can be used, though. You see, it seems this scroll charges the adventurers with appearing before King Liaden in 3 weeks' time. It details that they won the honor to serve him by the bravery shown when they stopped a kobold invasion in their own town. They killed some small monsters. What does that do for us? Gabriel asked. Very little, if not nothing. If you had let me finish, however, I would have made my point. This scroll details their exploits and their orders to meet the king, but at no point does it ever refer to them by name, only as the kobold slayers of Bluefall. That seems strange, Eric noted. Indeed. My money says the king is gearing up for some big hubbub and is recruiting every adventurer who can swing a sword or cast a spell. Likely he never knew the names of these four, only heard of their small success and decided to add them to whatever he has planned. Thistle paused, then tacked on, that is, of course, mere speculation. If you're right, it would mean they were summoned to see the king, but they haven't met or interacted with him yet, Eric said. That would be my deduction, Thistle confirmed. The scroll merely requests that the team of a paladin, a barbarian, a wizard, and a rogue known as the Kobold Slayers of Bluefall attend audience with the king to receive a quest. Sorry, but I'm still not seeing how this helps us at all, Gabriel said. It was Grumph who clarified the point. He stepped out from behind the bar and walked over to the corpse-laden table. 1, he rumbled, pointing to the armored body. 2, 3, 4, he gestured to each corpse in turn. He then turned to face the group and thrust his massive gray finger in Gabriel's direction. 1, he pointed next at Eric. 2, he moved his hand to the direction of the already nodding Thistle. 3, at last, he jabbed in his own direction, pressing his finger against his tremendous sternum. 4, my thoughts exactly, old friend, Thistle agreed. Whoa, 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 let's just hold on a second here, Eric protested, raising his hands and waving frantically. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Do you think I'm saying our best bet is to don their equipment and carry out the mission ourselves? Thistle asked in return. Yes, then yes. But that's suicide, Eric all but shrieked. We don't have any of their experience. We can't just start masquerading as them. Experience is gained through adventure, and we still have 3 weeks of traveling to gain the prerequisite necessary, Thistle pointed out. They clearly weren't very strong given how easily they died. It could well be possible to achieve a level of skill comparable to theirs. Given our training and a few weeks of effort, you're insane, Eric said, advancing on the gnome. You have finally lost your damn mind. There is no way we can pull this off. Back me up here, Gabby. Actually, Gabriel said slowly, I think I'm on board with this. What? If you think about it, it's basically certain death versus probable death. If we do nothing, we know the crazy king will do some murdering, and he has the resources to track. They're deaf to this tavern. On the other hand, if we pick up the equipment and give it a whirl, we'll still probably die, but at least we have a sliver of hope. Not to mention if we should fall further up the road, then the king will direct his murderous tendencies elsewhere. Thistle said. Eric had been about to raise another round of objections, but that pulled him up short. Thistle was saying what he should have already realized. Their fates were likely sealed regardless of what they did, but it needn't be so for their village. Eric had grown up here. He had friends here. His mother still lived and worked here. Thistle wasn't proposing this plan because he truly believed it would give them a better chance of survival. He was doing it because he believed it would give one to the people they loved. Eric's shoulders slumped as the wind flew out of his proverbial sails. "You're right," he admitted softly. "We have to do this. Glad you're with us," Thistle said. Now we come to the next part, division of roles. As the scroll stated, we still need a paladin, a rogue, a wizard, and a barbarian. "I guess I'm probably the best choice for wizard," Gabrielle said, stepping forward. "I have more formal education than the rest of you, and I doubt how much use I'd be in a fight. I'm already always getting kidnapped by goblins, true. And despite my crooks and hobbles, I'm likely the best choice for the rogue. I am, after all, not unfamiliar with shady dealings, since I have served as a henchman for many a tyrannical madman," Thistle said. "But you did that so you could sabotage them and give away their secrets to the warriors trying to take them down," Eric countered. "Knowledge is knowledge. How it was acquired is of no consequence, only how it is used," Thistle said. "That leaves the barbarian and the paladin. The paladin wears the armor, right?" Eric asked. "Yes," Gabrielle confirmed for him. "They also wear ardent moral standards and the divine blessing of goodness. I'm not sure about the other stuff, but I know how to maneuver an armor. It takes some practice, so I'm probably the best choice for that one," Eric said, which leaves only barbarian on the table. "Grumph, you possess the raw strength and boot-quaking level of intimidation to play that part well," Thistle said. Grumph gave only a nod to signal his agreement. "All right, then. Everyone sleep tonight and say your goodbyes tomorrow. Grumph and I will move the corpses, then tend to our own farewells. Meet back here at the same time tomorrow night," Thistle told them. "We'll loot the bodies and be on our way." The words that start every great adventure, Gabrielle quipped sarcastically. She might have been surprised to discover how accurate that statement truly was. 3. Eric packed a small bag of essentials from the modest farmhouse where he lived. He'd only had it for a few years, finally earning enough money as a guard for the local mayor to move out from under his mother's roof. He wasn't a particularly adept guard, in truth. The goblins had slipped by and taken Gabrielle no fewer than 3 times on his watch, in fact, were it not for his and Gabrielle's childhood friendship, the mayor likely would have dismissed him long ago. Thankfully, the mayor knew his daughter had few friends, so he deigned to keep Eric on the payroll, quasi-ineptitude and all. Eric slung the knapsack over his shoulder and adjusted his armor. He was already exhausted. Sleep had eluded him the night before, thanks to his bone-quaking levels of worry. Eric slipped his father's old sword into its sheath and checked his reflection in the mirror. When he'd become a guard, Eric had expected to see himself the way he saw them, heroic and stalwart, warriors in their shining armor. Instead, he thought he looked like a child playing dress-up, his ill-fitting armor cinched tightly around his narrow frame. Eric's mother often spoke of his father, the great paladin and unconquerable swordsman. Eric supposed he must take after her side of the family, though, a line of not unimpressive seamstresses and tailors. He looked around his home one last time, then set out to bid farewell to his mother. He hoped that the next time he came upon this cottage, it would not be mere ashes under the king's heel. Gabrielle didn't bother with goodbyes since her parents wouldn't have let her go anyway. It was all well and good for men to strike out alone, but there was no way her family would tolerate a lady leaving her father's homestead before marriage. She packed a sack of rations and changed into her horse-riding outfit once morning broke over the horizon. After breakfast, she gave her mother a hug and her father a kiss and told them she was going to spend the day riding the horses. Gabrielle adored riding, and she often went late into the night with her equine friends. When she didn't come home, they'd be annoyed but not worried. It Wouldn't be until the next morning that they'd suspect she might not be returning. A stray tear may have slipped from Gabrielle's eye as her steed broke into a gallop. Despite their meddling, she truly did love her parents greatly. She hated having to make them worry as they would when she vanished. Still, it was that same love for them that spurred her on, away from the comfortable life she'd known since birth. This was the only chance she had. To protect them, she urged her horse to run faster. Gabrielle was not one to linger on sadness or hard decisions, so she raced forward as fast as she could to meet her future. The grave on the hill was small and simple, yet painstakingly maintained. It was marked by a modest headstone and overlooked a brook that was about an hour's walk from town. It had been one of her favorite spots. Thistle had dug the grave himself so that his wife might have a pleasant view for eternity. "I'm afraid I won't be able to visit again for some time," he said, voice rising over the gentle lap of the water on the bank. "The winds have begun to blow again, it seems." Thistle adjusted his stance in a vain attempt to find a comfortable way to stand on the hill's sloping surface. "I don't want you to worry about me. I'll be safe. Grumph is coming along, and so are the human pair I've told you about. Before, they're green as a dryad's hair, but good kids overall. Who knows? We might just pull off this little charade." The small gnome paused and looked out at the scenery. It was truly lovely here. He had hoped to be buried on this hill alongside her when his god called him home. Sadly, it wasn't looking too likely now. The only one he'd have trusted with the burial task was Grumph, and Thistle had a feeling that if he fell on their journey, Grumph and the others wouldn't be far behind. "And if we don't," Thistle added, "then I suppose I'll be seeing you soon anyway." Thistle gently touched his fingertips to the headstone, then shambled down the hill and began the long trek back toward town. Grumph didn't have a family in Maple Bark. He didn't have graves to visit either. The only person he truly counted as a friend was Thistle, and that wily gnome was coming with him. Grumph did have his tavern, though. He ran his hands along the wooden planks of the bar, remembering how long it had taken him to get the measurements just so. He sipped the mead, savoring its flavor, thinking of all the careful testing and calculations required to get his brew perfect. Grumph sat at one of the many tables he had constructed in one of the chairs he had carved and simply took it all in. He had built this bar with love and considerable strength. It had taken the Maple Bark residents time to adjust to a half-orc in their midst, but eventually Grumph had been accepted and doing business with all manner of citizens. Grumph hadn't just built a business here, he'd carved a home. And he'd come to love this hamlet of Maple Bark, plagued by the occasional weak monsters and villains though it was. Grumph was under no illusions. Much as he loved his bar, his creation, it wasn't a building that made a place home. It was the people. As Grumph poured the lamp fluid on the floor and the tables, he was struck by the poignancy of it all. Destroying his house to protect his home. There was a knock on the door signaling the first of his companions' arrivals. Perhaps it would be Thistle, and there would be time for one last drink. The last drink, as it were. Grumph's tavern burned at their backs as they trekked slowly through the forest. "I still don't get it," Eric said as he checked his footing in hopes of avoiding another impressive tumble. "Why did he burn the bar? Let me put it to you this way. What usually happens to abandoned taverns and inns?" Thistle asked him. "They get inhabited by monsters or bandit gangs," Eric replied. It was common knowledge after all. Adventurers often sought out such locations when hunting for a good fight. Precisely. Now, setting aside the logistical concerns of creating a temptation like that in our little town, Grumph built that tavern himself. He poured a piece of himself into its frame and foundation. He cared for it with more affection than I've seen some show their children. The idea of some ruffians wrecking it, or kobolds shitting on its floor, It's just too much. Just try to understand that sometimes it is better to see a thing destroyed rather than ruined. Thistle hopped lightly along the path in hope of keeping up with his larger companions. It was a difficult proposition, but one he had managed for many years now. Gabriel patted the half-orc lightly on his muscular arm. "Sorry about your bar," Grumph replied with little more than a grunt, a sound that spoke to both his profound sadness and his appreciation of the heartfelt sentiment. Or it meant he was hungry, or just didn't have many unique sounds, so there was a lot of room for misinterpretation. The party, for that is what they were whether they liked it or not, had set out at dusk into the woods. They had chosen to walk and avoid main roads for two reasons. First was that Gabriel's family would send people looking for her, and they needed to make a clean break into their new identities if they hoped to succeed. The other reason was because they hoped to encounter some weak monsters. They might have the tools and garb to pass in their new professions, but none of them had the skills. For that purpose, they would travel at night when the most monsters were loose, leaving study and rest for the days. It would take them longer to reach the city of Solium. However, it also provided the greatest opportunity for being prepared when they arrived. To their rear, the smoke billowed into the empty night sky, despite their hopes. They encountered no animal or monster worth fighting through the evening. In fact, they made such good progress that only Eric heard the fire when it reached the liquor tanks in the basement, sending a fresh fireball into the night and a loud boom across the land. Despite their fears and the sense of dread lingering over them, the group made it through the night without being killed or discovered. When they rose after a few hours of unrestful sleep, each set about attending to the task they felt most important, using the daylight to its fullest. Eric took a few swings with his new blade, managing to accidentally hack off some tree branches in the process. The previous paladin had possessed fine taste in steel. There was no doubt about that. The long sword was well crafted and perfectly balanced. It was also unnecessarily ornate. A gold-plated design worked along the guard and onto the hilt. Unfortunately, its previous owner had also possessed thicker arms than Eric, leading him to struggle with wielding the blade effectively. Back in his guard position, he'd gotten away with using his father's old short sword, its status as an heirloom saving him from merciless teasing by the other guards. Thistle was also adapting to his new equipment. The rogue had kept a pair of long, wickedly serrated daggers that nearly looked like swords in Thistle's small hands. Still, he was at least proficient with his weapons, twirling them about and practicing a few of the defensive moves he'd learned in his younger, more ambitious days. Testing the heft of his left dagger, Thistle cradled it carefully before whipping his arm suddenly and hurling it into a nearby tree. The dagger stuck true, cleaving a few inches deep before wobbling to a rest. Thistle sighed. Accuracy he still had. Power, it seemed, he would need to work on. Gabrielle was seated cross-legged on the ground, a safe distance away from the whirling pieces of steel wielded by her comrades. She focused on the wizard's book, picking through its open pages and trying to piece together the art of weaving a spell. Gabrielle turned the piece of worn parchment and began to appreciate the reason wizards spent so much time in school learning their craft. While she could comprehend some of the concepts being put forth, it seemed like grasping the whole would take far more than a quick perusing. Of the four, only Grumph was attending to a more immediate concern rather than training. He gathered up some berries and tough meat scraps along with the water from a local brook to concoct a soup. It certainly wasn't his finest culinary achievement. However, in the wild, one had to make do with what was available. Grumph's new axe rested near him, relatively untouched. Grumph knew how to swing and knew how to aim. He had faith he would learn the rest through action rather than practice. Besides, they would need to eat, then rest if they wanted to continue on their way with the setting of the sun. It was Eric who heard the first rustling, which was unfortunate. Gabrielle had spent enough time in nature. Thistle had enough experience, and Grumph was simply smart enough to know a rustling bush should always be looked at with suspicion. Eric, on the other hand, merely dismissed it as the wind and continued as he had been taught, blocking out all distractions and focusing on the training at hand. By the time the gentle movement of the leaves reached Thistle's ears, it was too late to implement any plan aside from bracing for impact. "Boys and girl," Thistle said softly yet firmly, "I believe we are soon to have company in our clearing." Gabrielle kept her book open, but seized the quarterstaff at her side while rising to her feet. Grumph kept his eyes trained on the soup. His hands, however, moved deftly and certainly as they wrapped around his axe. Eric pulled his sword up to a fighting stance, eyes darting around nervously as he searched for the threat. "A word of encouragement," Thistle said, just before the commotion erupted. "Don't die. We aren't nearly far enough away yet." "I'll try to keep that in mind," Gabrielle said through clenched teeth. After that, there was no time for words or banter. FOUR. The wheels of the sturdy cart cages absorbed the bounces from the multitude of uneven drops in the road, making the trip back to camp surprisingly pleasant for the prisoners. Gabrielle sat in one cart cage at the front of the convoy, speaking to her captors in a series of loud growls and clicks. Behind her was a cart containing Eric and Thistle, both silent. Eric was nursing a nasty blow he'd taken to the head. At the rear of the convoy was the best built of all the cages, this one dedicated only to the task of holding Grumph. To call what had taken place a battle would be an overstatement. Even skirmish would be giving the new adventurers too much credit. Goblins, while physically weaker than humans, were experienced in dealing with stronger opponents and skilled in using the environment to their advantage. By the time the party had braced for battle, 20 archers had emerged from the bush, followed immediately by 10 warriors with polearms. Making a snap decision, Thistle had immediately called out their surrender. 5 arrows apiece was more than he felt confident most of them could endure, and those who did survive wouldn't be in any shape to fight off a polearm. Once they'd thrown down their weapons, a goblin runner had been dispatched, returning less than an hour later with some other goblins riding ponies, and of course, the cage carts. While getting inside, Eric had managed to slip on the step and strike his head against one of the rear planks, resulting in the one and only injury from their battle. "I've got good news and bad news," Gabrielle called from her cart in the front. She'd been gibbering with the goblins since their departure, greeting them with such familiarity that the others found it somewhat disconcerting. "Bad news is that, now that they know I'm here, they're going to send a runner into town to announce it and lure out adventurers. The good news is that it's almost sunset, so they won't do it until morning." "Gabby, pray tell, when did you learn to speak the goblin language?" Thistle asked, his restrained voice as polite as he could make it. "Goblik isn't hard to learn if you have a decent teacher," Gabrielle replied. "I learned it years ago from one of the goblin commanders who can speak the proper kingdom language." "I think Thistle was more asking about why you speak it," Eric clarified. "Because things would be really boring if I didn't. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 weeks between when they kidnap me and when the adventurers would arrive for the rescue. That's a lot of downtime, and the goblins only let me pack so many books when they would kidnap me." "They let you pack?" Eric asked, certain his ears had deceived him like the vile villains they were. "They did once I explained to them that it would make my downtime more pleasant. Don't get me wrong, they make a point of teaching me things about the forest and taking me on hunts, but they've got real things to do and can't spend all day defending me from boredom. It's pleasing to know we have such kind hosts, Thistle said, jumping in before Eric asked any more questions that might ultimately give the young man a stroke. Any chance they'd let us out of the cages once we arrive at their war camp? I don't think so. If it were just me, certainly, but since they don't know you all, I get the feeling they're trying to keep up appearances. They didn't even bring my usual horse for me to ride. She has her own horse, Eric muttered, slinking down against the firm yet pliable wooden bars of his moving cell. I once stayed up for 30 hours straight to guard her door because we heard goblins were in the area, and she has her own horse she rides away on. River Jump is not my horse, Gabrielle defended. She's just one I like, and who knows me? Bringing her makes the whole process easier on everyone. Gabby, I think. Perhaps we should let Eric be for a bit, Thistle encouraged. About how far would you say we are from their camp, with no monster encounters? We'll be there within the hour. Very well. And you, old friend? How are you faring back there? Thistle called. Grumph let out a harumph, which indicated either that he was unharmed and waiting patiently for a new opportunity to arise, or that a sparrow had shit in his porridge. Thistle nodded that he understood and took a seat across from Eric in the cart. His crooked little mind was already working on a plan for escape. However, it would do no good if his crooked little body was too worn out from standing through the ride. Now was the time to play patient. They would have at least a few days before any more adventures happened through town. Opportunity would come eventually. As it turned out, Opportunity had far less patience than Thistle. The goblin camp was somewhat homier than Thistle had imagined. Certainly there were bulwarks of defense, archer stations, barriers to trip horses, even a few oddly colored patches of earth Thistle suspected to be traps. But there were also things that made no sense in this setting. Things like goblin children racing around, goblin cooks tending to the night's evidently sizable dinner, and several goblin musicians warming up their strange instruments as the last valiant rays of sunlight dotted the landscape. Gabby, is the camp always so domestic? Thistle asked. Their cages had been parked next to one another while Grumph sat on the other side of the fire that was the center point of the camp. The goblins had clearly dealt with half-orcs enough to minimize the damage he'd have the opportunity to do. No, this is how it is when they aren't baiting adventurers, Gabrielle replied. Once the runner goes out in the morning, they'll move everyone but the warriors to some other site. Then, once it's over, they'll all come back. To what? Corpses? Eric asked. Won't the warriors be dead after they fight the adventurers? What? Why would you think that? This is their home turf, and they know the adventurers are coming. The goblins almost always win, and even if they lose, they're smart enough to have a retreat plan. Then, why do you always come back after the adventurers leave to get you? Eric kept probing. Because they let me go. I'm just bait to lure the adventurers in so they can loot them. Once that's done, they let me go until they're ready to trap another party. Gabriel looked at him, eyes filled with bewilderment that he'd even needed to ask the question. Knock off the innocent act, Gabby, Thistle chided. If you really didn't see anything strange with how you'd been treated, then you'd have told us some of this before. Fine. So maybe the kidnappings weren't as bad as everyone assumed. Gabriel breathed out a heavy sigh and let the faux innocence slide away. At first it was scary, but after a while, it's hard not to find some common ground with people you see every day. Honestly, for the last few years, these events have been like vacations for me, trips outside the protective bubble of being the mayor of Maple Bark's daughter. Eric didn't know what to say to this, his eyes darting about nervously. As they moved, he saw action in another part of the camp and decided a change of subject was in order. Hey, what are they doing over there? Gabriel glanced over. Oh, it looks like they found an abandoned caravan and are sorting the goods. In front of a large building, easily the most hardly constructed and well defended in the camp, stood several goblins wearing makeshift armor. Before them were other goblins leading ponies and a cart filled nearly to the brim with bric-a-brac. In the center of the crowd was an older goblin wearing a dirt brown robe, examining each item as it came off the cart. Some he sent into the building, others were moved to a different spot in the camp, and a few went back on the cart. The one in the middle is an elder. He's tasked with figuring out which pieces of loot have the most value. Those go in the storage building. Bits that are useful but not expensive are given out to others in the camp that can use them. The things going back into the cart are for the other scavenger teams to split up, based on who needs what. When they sell the expensive items at market in a few weeks, everyone will get a cut, Gabriel explained. You'd think the ones who found it would get more, Eric pointed out. Goblins don't think like that. They regard everyone in the tribe as one big party and believe in a system of equal treasure sharing, Gabriel informed him. There might have been more discussion of goblin economics had the elder not chosen that moment to open a small box he'd been handed, revealing a glowing red gem the size of Grump's fist. Excited grunts and clicks filled the area around them, many goblins crowding in to get a closer look. From the vantage point of the cage carts, the three rookie adventurers could make out the soft radiance of presumably magical light and the dazzling red surface. It was only Eric, however, whose eyes noticed the slight swirls of color within the gem, and he didn't know what to make of it. Strange, Thistle remarked. If they found an abandoned caravan, one would have expected the people who left it to take such a clearly valuable item. Maybe it was hit by robbers who left this much stuff? Gabriel said, I saw them take in small sets of armor, and what I suspect was a magical bow earlier. No bandit in their right mind leaves behind equipment like that. They could have been eaten by monsters, Eric suggested. At present, that seems like the most likely option. Thistle agreed. Their conversation was cut short by the sound of the door to Thistle and Eric's cage opening. A pair of goblins stood in the doorway with several more just outside. The message of don't try anything came through loud and clear before a single click was uttered. Another team of goblins opened the door to Gabriel's cage, motioning her to exit with far kinder expression. The one nearest to Thistle, tall for a goblin and wearing a red buckler on his arm, spoke up. He wants you to take off the armor, Gabriel translated, looking at Eric as she was escorted over to their cage cart. None but the paladin corpse had armor that would fit them, and Eric had examined it only to determine it would be more effort than it was worth to try and get accustomed to it. Instead, he'd elected to keep his guard armor on, since that at least he was accustomed to dealing with. When they'd been captured, part of him had hoped they'd leave it be. But now, he realized it was merely a matter of waiting for a more convenient time to take it from him. Red buckler clicked again. He says they will cut it off you, but they'd prefer if you did this voluntarily since it will damage the armor less. Sure, why not? Eric sighed, pulling himself to his feet. Honestly, I don't even like wearing the stuff. It's heavy, it's loud, and I'm always tripping over myself wearing it. He began carefully removing each piece, a process that grew quicker as the amount of armor he wore lessened. Still, I don't think I'm much a paladin without any armor. Right now, the only identity aspect any of us should concern ourselves with is staying alive, Thistle reminded him. Eric continued to strip off the metal adornments until they all lay in a pile at his feet. Red Buckler stayed by the door while the other goblins formed a quick conveyor line to move the armor out of the cage. Once that was done, Gabriel was sent into the cage with Thistle and Eric. Before the door was closed, a burlap sack was brought in and set before them. Red Buckler made a few goblin sounds and left. He thanked us for being cooperative, Gabriel said. Thistle opened the sack to reveal a generous amount of bread, cheese, meat slices, and even a bottle of wine. I've been held by worse hosts. I'll give them that, Thistle said, helping himself to a slice of bread. In the transport of the party after the scramble, their equipment had been strapped to the backs of various goblins, since they obviously weren't going to allow prisoners to have weapons. The only item of difficulty had been the spell book. Goblins understood the value of magic, especially when bargaining. However, they also knew that magical items were unstable, and the less time spent around them, the safer. Spell books especially were frequently booby-trapped by wizards to discourage their theft. The result of this knowledge was a healthy disinterest in being the goblins stuck holding onto any items dealing with magic. After 5 minutes of bickering about who would have to hold the book, they'd ultimately reach the compromise of throwing it in the cage with the half-orc. If it was trapped, it would only hurt him, and the worst thing he would be able to do by reading it was set himself on fire or turn. His feet into pudding. At first, Grump had ignored the book, focusing instead on taking in his surroundings and examining his cage for weak points. Once they arrived, and he was stuck away from the rest of his party, boredom teamed up with curiosity to prompt him into flipping through its pages. The vast majority of them were blank. Only about 5 had actually been filled out. The wizard it belonged to truly had been just starting out. Each spell was interesting, a combination of mental images, physical gestures, and specific words, all required to invoke the magic contained within. For most, they would have been very difficult to memorize, especially under pressure. For a veteran bartender who memorized all his mead recipes so they couldn't be stolen, it was relatively easy. Strangely, in all of these specific instructions for how to cast each spell, there was never any mention of what the effects would be. Grump quickly realized this was likely by design, so that even if the book was stolen, anyone with a smattering of sense would be too smart to cast a spell they couldn't predict. The flaw in this strategy was that it failed to take into account a person who was aware they could soon find themselves in a life or death situation. Grump turned back to the first page and began reading again. He didn't know if barbarians were supposed to cast spells, but he didn't really care. If a spellcasting barbarian was an oddity, then he would simply be the first. Grump had never been one to wait for others to clear the trail in advance. 5. As night fell in earnest, more goblins began gathering in the central area of the camp. Tables were set up, food brought out, and charming melodies filled the air as the musicians started to play, though the sound wasn't traditional or familiar to anyone but Gabriel. Each of the party members found themselves enjoying it. Warm, peppy, and with an exciting tempo, music helped make them feel at least somewhat at ease with their situation. "Do they always party like this?" Eric asked. Gabriel shook her head. "This is the celebration they throw the night before trying to bait adventurers. It's partly an offering to Grebsplik, one of the goblin deities of the hunt, but mostly it's a last meal with the warriors and their families. Some of them probably won't live to see another hunt. I've often wondered about that, actually," Thistle piped up. "Why bother luring out adventurers at all? Surely there are safer ways to live." "I asked that once," Gabriel said. "They know adventurers would come after them anyway, though they aren't sure why. But this way, they control the circumstances and give themselves the best chance of survival. Evidently, almost no adventurers go goblin hunting when there's a kidnapping to pursue. Plus, they get about 30% of their income from looting dead adventurers." Thistle let out a low whistle that sounded dry, despite the ample water available to them. "A not unhefty sum. I'm still stuck on the fact that they have a deity named Grebsplik," Eric admitted. "It's a rough translation, Goblet names sound like the rest of the language. Part of why I haven't tried to introduce any of you. Still seems silly, Eric replied. Don't be too quick to judge another's deity, Thistle cautioned. I myself am a devout follower of a god with an unimpressive name. Yet Grumble is a kind and devoted god to his followers. I've never heard of a god named Grumble, Gabriel said. Nor would I have expected you to. His shrines are modest and off to the side in any temple, but they are abundant if you know how to find them. Grumble is the god of henchmen and minions. Once a former lackey himself, after his deification, he chose to look over his own people rather than putting on airs. I can see how that guy might get some followers, Eric said. He knew the minions were the lowest on the hierarchy of any organization, regarded as disposable and useless by most commanders. At that thought, he took a long stretch, enjoying the sensation of his muscles' movements now that he was unrestrained by the armor. In truth, he hadn't been much more than a minion himself. Maybe he should drop a prayer to this deity next time he was in a temple. Around them, the festivities had begun to escalate. As plates were cleaned of food, more goblins transitioned from eating to dancing. There was no established pattern that any of the adventurers could make out, no coordinated effort to create a temporary moment of sublime beauty. Mostly, it was just each goblin going out near the fire, finding a spot clear of others, and thrashing about in whatever way delighted them most. There was no grace or delicacy in their movements, yet it was strangely entrancing all the same. Perhaps it was by the way they felt so free to dance in any style that pleased them, with no apprehension or fear of being judged by the others of their tribe. The musicians picked up the tempo. This, it seemed, was an unspoken signal as many more goblins rose from their seats and began to dance. Soon there wasn't room enough for everyone to move without contacting another, but this didn't dissuade them. Small claws scraped against a neighbor's skin, feet were stomped on repeatedly, and occasionally a pair would end up tangled together, crashing to the ground in a still writhing heap. None of this seemed to diminish the goblins' enjoyment in the slightest. No, what it took to kill the party was a massive explosion from the rear of the camp that sent chunks of wood and unknown trinkets flying through the air. The music stopped abruptly, and the dancers immediately crouched into ready positions. Some of the warriors reached for the weapons at their sides, and the archers on the perimeter turned their attention to the smoking husk. It was their storage building, now bathed in a soft red glow from the pieces that were still on fire. For a moment, silence descended upon the camp, save only for the soft crackling of the flames. Then they heard the clacking of claws and the scraping of feet. Eric said nothing as he stared at the blade, still quivering in the wood less than 2 inches from his head. There hadn't been time to react, not rationally, when they heard the explosion. Eric had merely glanced at the storage building, seen something coming, and hurled himself to the side. So great was the force from the blast that the axe Grumph had been carrying whipped through one set of the cage's bars with ease, sinking at least halfway into the wooden barriers on the other side. Eric was intimately familiar with that spot. His head had been there only an instant before. The fuck? Gabriel said at last, eyes trained on the smoldering building uncomfortably close to them. It was strange the way the flames were cascading through the smoke. It almost appeared that there were shapes moving in the wreckage. It must be a mirage. Her party members were the only ones large enough to make such shadows, and they were all stuck in cages. We need to go, Thistle said, grabbing his companion's attention. While the others had been caught up in shock, he'd examined the hole that the axe had carved through the cage's bars. It wasn't too large, big enough for him to fit through without much trouble, though the same couldn't be said for the humans. In this instance, however, the cage's flexibility worked to its disadvantage. While a material that moved made breaking through more difficult, once a hole was carved, it meant areas could be stretched as needed. "Go," Eric asked, still unwilling to look away from the axe that tried to behead him. "Vamos, escape, do the kobold charge." "Run away," Thistle clarified. "Someone blowing up part of an entrenched goblin encampment means an attack, and I prefer not to be unarmed and trapped in a cage during such circumstances." "You're wrong," Gabriel declared. "These goblins are smart and safe. No one could have surprised them like this. It was probably just some magic item they didn't know was going to blow up. We're in no danger. That theory is a good one," Thistle complimented, "but it doesn't explain why the goblins all seem to be braced for attack." A quick glance confirmed he was right. The children and non-warrior goblins were being herded toward the other side of the camp, while those with armor and weapons slowly advanced toward the remains of the storage shed. It was then that Eric's human hearing finally caught up to what the goblins' large ears had already noticed. "What is that noise?" Thistle and Gabriel cocked their own heads, listening intently. Now that he'd pointed it out, there was a strange clacking sound coming from the burning building. To Gabriel, it was completely alien. However, Thistle went white as a wicket when he heard it. "We need to get out and clear now." Thistle tugged on Eric's tunic. In a motion quicker than one would have suspected his knobby form capable of, the gnome slipped through the hole and landed softly on the ground. "Why do you know what it is?" Eric asked. Thistle opened his mouth to speak, and as he did, the first of the monsters stepped into view. It was hideous, 6 feet tall with red, gnarled flesh along its twisted body. Atop its shoulders sat the head of a malformed rat, upper jaw stretched out inches further than its lower. Instead of hands, it had claws like that of scorpion, the clacking sound suddenly making a sickly amount of sense to all in attendance. Despite all of this, it was the eyes that were most disconcerting, black orbs like midnight dipped in ink. Looking into one, a person couldn't help but feel like they were being sucked into that abyss. "Demons," Thistle said, his voice scarcely above a whisper. Grumph had put the book down when the celebration began, and he'd stood up in the cage after the explosion. Rocked the camp. However, since he was closer to the lines of warriors than the others, Grumph was less impetuous about getting free from his mobile prison. As they began advancing toward the building, Grumph shuffled his position slightly. The goblins had their back to him, and the explosion had dropped his importance in their list of immediate priorities, yet he was patient. Grumph did not move until he saw something that compelled him to it. Was not seeing the demon emerge from the smoking ruins, nor was it observing a few of the goblins near the rear drop their weapons and flee. No, the signal that told Grumph things were getting dangerous was when he caught sight of the terror on Thistle's face. He'd known the gnome for many years, and anything that spooked him in such a manner was not to be taken lightly. The goblin cages were sturdy, well-designed, and built to last. Grumph was impressed by their construction. Had he been a mere mindless brute, the cage would have proved more than a match for his strength. By contrast, had he possessed the knowledge to assess such a contraption, but not the power to act on such information, he would also have been stuck. Thankfully, Grumph was an experienced craftsman with muscles cultivated by centuries of half-orc breeding. In a controlled motion, he seized one of the areas in the corner where a bar had been improperly bound. With a grunt of effort that would have been noticeable in any other situation, demons do tend to steal focus. Grumph tore the bars apart. From there, it was a simple matter to disassemble a few exposed binding cords and knock away a section large enough for him to emerge from. He landed softly, choosing stealth over speed, the whole process having taken less than a minute. In that time, 3 more of the creatures had stepped forth from the fire. In the chaos, Grumph couldn't quite make out whether his friends were free from their cage yet. A quick survey of the ground at his feet netted Grumph an abandoned goblin polearm. It felt more akin to a dagger on a stick in his considerable hands, but he would take it over nothing. With careful steps, Grumph began edging his way around the bulk of the goblin troops and toward his friend's cage. He might have made it unnoticed too if the demons hadn't chosen that moment to leap. The first landed dead center in the mass of the goblin warriors, letting out a horrendous shriek as it seized one in each claw. Another came down on the side of the camp where the largest exit was, clacking its claws excitedly. The initial demon to emerge stayed put. Evidently, it felt no need for relocation. The final demon leapt the furthest, soaring through the air and landing with a muffled thump. It was less than 4 sword lengths away from Grumph. 6. When the demon emerged, the humans had needed very little in terms of convincing to leave the cage. Eric slid out with relative ease, his narrow, lean frame no longer encumbered by the heavy metal burden that had weighed him down. Gabrielle had found the task a bit tougher, though brought up a proper lady, her love of horse riding and self-defense. Courses, in a vain attempt to stem her kidnappings, had left her strong and somewhat more muscular than one might imagine. After 2 unsuccessful tries to squeeze through the cage, she took a new approach. Seizing the axe wedged on the far side, Gabrielle jerked it free with a solid pull, then slid its head through the hole and set it on the ground. Using the shaft for balance, and with Eric's help, she was finally able to maneuver her way out of the wooden cage and land safely on the ground. Safely here was a relative term, since she was still in proximity of a clock-lacking demon and several dozen armed goblins. Still, she wasn't trapped, and that was progress. Gabrielle's freedom nearly coincided with the demons leaping. She landed only moments before they took off. For an instant, she thought it was a good thing. After all, fewer demons near them meant a higher possibility of living. To see the sunrise, didn't it? Dragon shit, Thistle muttered as he watched the horrid creatures crash back down to the dirt. What? Eric asked. They're coordinating, Thistle explained. The one in the center is there to draw focus and stir up chaos among the warriors. Meanwhile, the 3 on the outside can pick off the ones on the edges of the crowd while still cutting off the best exit routes. This is very bad. Demons set on a random slaughter are troublesome, but can be outmaneuvered. When they're smart enough to work together, well, let's simply say our survival chances just got lower. What do we do? Gabrielle asked. Without thinking, she pulled the axe up from the ground and brought it to rest on her shoulder. It might not be of much use to her, but better a clumsy weapon than none at all. You to get clear, Thistle ordered. Grab any weapons or armor you see on the way out. It wouldn't do to be picked off by wolves after escaping demons. And get out of camp, and what will you be doing while we're turning tail? Eric asked. Someone has to go check on Grumph, Thistle replied. And I certainly draw far less attention in this crowd than you two. That part was true. The gnome stood nearly shoulder to shoulder with the goblins, meaning he could blend in easily. To humans would stick out like, well, like a pair of humans in a crowd of goblins. I don't want to leave you like that, Eric said. Good sentiment. Hold on to that later on when we're back to playing our roles. This isn't you abandoning me, though. This is you trusting me to do my job and not making me worry about you as well. We're a party. We each have our own tasks to fulfill, Thistle explained. Eric didn't particularly like that answer, but he also didn't foresee changing Thistle's mind, and the longer they were here, the worse their chances of survival grew. Fine, Eric agreed at last. We meet at the clearing we passed on the way in. Deal, Thistle said, almost immediately darting off into the crowd. Works for me, Gabriel added. Glad we're all agreed. Now, which way should we go to get out of here? "I'm going for a gap I know about on the west side of the camp." Gabriel pointed somewhere past the goblin warriors. "You should probably go another route. I have to pass a lot of goblins on my way. They know me and won't attack in surprise. I can't say the same for you. Plus, it's probably better to go separate ways, just in case." Eric nodded. There was no need for explanation. They were in a very dire situation, and the odds of all of them making it out were slim at best. At least going different ways meant one might find a clear path. "Be safe," he told. You too." With that, each hunkered down and began moving away as quickly and quietly as they were able to manage. There are few sensations like staring eye to eye with a demon, nothing between you and it, but a polearm that somehow felt even smaller than it had moments ago. Grumph and the beast locked eyes with each other for less than half a second, yet both could feel the weight of a lifetime in that glance. There was no need for pretense. This moment ended with one of them dead. No other outcome was possible. That sentiment was dispelled when 3 arrows lodged in the demon's back, earning a sickening twist of its rat-like head in an unnatural angle toward its attackers. Behind it stood 3 goblin warriors and a quartet of archers, separated from their main force. The warriors were advancing slowly, polearms extended, while the archers knocked fresh arrows into their bows. With a series of jerking steps, the demon turned its attention toward the goblins. Evidently, it cared more for quantity than size, as Grumph was left largely forgotten, facing its rear. One of the goblin archers met his half-forked gaze and began speaking fiercely at him. Though Grumph didn't speak Goblic, the shoe-hand gestures that the goblin made sent the message quite clearly. They were going to handle this thing. He should run away quickly while the opportunity was there. Moments earlier, staring down a demon, Grumph might have considered it, but now watching his captors, small though they were, confront this monster on his behalf, such an idea was ludicrous. He felt no particular love for these goblins. They were merely beings who'd captured him because he was easy prey, but that as it was, he loathed demons, and he'd be damned to see these ravage the camp. At the very least, he would assist until the children and non-warriors escaped. Grumph tightened his grip on the polearm and felt it creak under the pressure. He dearly wished he'd found something more substantial. Eric, in a show of either cunning or stupidity, the difference between the two being an idea works or not, elected to go the one direction that no one was paying attention to. Creeping along, he made his way to the storage building, which was still burning, but rapidly turning into more of a smolder than an inferno. The first demon had advanced several feet forward and was now in the process of slicing through a pair of goblins, while others of the tribe slashed at it angrily. In the soft light of the fire, Eric slipped through a gap between the storage building and the rubble of what had once been a home. The heat from the flames was strong. Sweat materialized on his face as soon as he was alongside the building's remains. It was slow going, as the gap between the two areas had been designed for only goblins to fit through. Moving through the area at all would have been impossible if the explosion hadn't destroyed large sections of both buildings' walls. Even with that, it took careful footing and balance as, at times, Eric had to climb from gap to gap, getting several feet off the ground. He marveled at the speed of his body, feeling, for the first time in years, the freedom of movement when not confined by that damn armor. He'd only ever taken it off for bathing in bed, activities which rarely offered the chance to stretch his limbs. He was back on the ground, moving beside a gap in the storage building so large it accounted for at least an eighth of the wall, when he saw it. Sitting there, miraculously untouched by the explosion or the fire, resting on a pile of wrecked chests, was his sword, not the cumbersome one he'd lifted from the paladin's corpse, but his sword. The one his father had given him when he was a child, meant to be a training blade. The one he'd used as a guard, even though the others had laughed at him for it. The one he'd been able to leave behind, even when packing light less than a day ago, his sword. Without a thought, Eric reached through the hole and grabbed the hilt of his blade. It was warm, but not as hot as he'd expected. Given the environment, the scabbard had melted slightly. However, the blade still pulled free with a little effort. Eric sheathed it once more, tucked it into his belt, and continued his movements toward freedom. In almost no time, he'd passed the final few hunks of rubble obscuring the way and stepped out of the narrow gap. Eric was surprised by how sweet the night air smelled. The tight goblin perimeter had contained much of the soot and violence, so much so that once on the other side of the buildings, the world seemed almost peaceful. There were still a few more traps and hurdles to get around. But as Eric looked out into the dark depths of the forest, reality set in. He'd made it. He was free. In different circumstances, Gabriel might have made it. Her idea had been a sound one: sneak behind the bulk of the warriors to a secret getaway path she knew about. It was near the main entrance, obscured enough that one wouldn't find it unless they knew it was there. Her movements were controlled, careful, and precise. She knew this camp well, and if any of the goblin warriors noticed her making for the exit, they did nothing to impede her. For one thing, she'd been around so much they considered her a friend. For another, they had far bigger problems on their hands: the demon in the center of the warriors was beginning to show signs of wear. Tough though its hide was, the sheer number of arrows and polearms were beginning to tear away bits of its flesh. The one near the building seemed to be faring better. Not enough of the goblins were focused on it, and the monster was dropping their numbers with nearly every swipe of its claws. Gabriel couldn't make out the one that had jumped across the camp, but she assumed it was probably doing well too. For a time, she didn't know where the fourth demon had landed. Then she arrived at her exit point. At first, her heart felt lighter as she saw the swarm of goblins around the demon. This many would end it swiftly, and then they could focus on the other two. The tribe might just have a shot at this. Then she noticed how quickly they were falling and realized few of them had armor or weapons. A quick glance toward the area where the secret getaway was located showed that the entrance was blocked with goblin corpses. The reason there were so many goblins around it was because the demon had caught onto their escape attempt and sealed it. Now it stood between them and escape on the main road. It wasn't being swarmed with warriors. It was cutting a swath of death through the children and peaceful goblins that had been trying to evacuate. Thistle moved with all the speed his crooked, gnomish body could muster, which was, unsurprisingly, not a lot. Thankfully, the focus on the incursion of demons made sure he was the last concern on the minds of the goblins he gently moved past. Along the way, he followed his own advice and snagged a pair of mismatched daggers from the corpses of fallen archers. They weren't as well made as the ones he'd taken from the dead rogue, but they had pointy ends he could stab into people, and that was really all that mattered in a dagger. Of the four, he was the last to reach his destination, both because of the difficulty of what he was moving through and his hobbled size. He did make it without incident, which was more than he imagined the other two would have pulled off. Thistle hoped those two would be safe. Maybe if they survived they could recruit new people to fill the party's holes and draw the king's ire from their town. It was what Thistle would have done. However, he was less confident in his own survival than theirs. They still had the strength and determination of youth. It was then that Thistle broke through the mass of goblins into the area where Grumph was, and all thought of the humans' safety flitted from his mind. 7 fresh goblin corpses littered the ground around the demon, their light purple blood already soaking into the dirt. A few feet away, Grumph lay on his side, struggling to get up with the one arm that wasn't covered in blood. A shattered goblin polearm stuck out from the demon's hide, wedged into the shoulder above its right claw. In an instant, Thistle knew what had happened. He saw the goblin regiment's death, followed by Grumph rushing in and smashing the demon with a weapon not designed to bear his strength, snapping it off in red flesh only to have his own half-orc body savaged by the monster's counterattack. Thistle put it all together, and in the span of a heartbeat, he extended the scene moments into the future. Seeing what would play out as plain as a sunlight spell, Grumph was about to die. 7. There were surely better ways to die than this. Going down in battle was a point of pride, certainly, but it was supposed to be while making a grand last stand for some important cause. All Grumph had done was whack a polearm against a demon while it was killing several goblins. From the pain in his shoulder and the sizable chunk of missing flesh, he didn't imagine this was going to be a peaceful death. The demon was approaching steadily, but cautiously. Grumph let out a weary sigh that sounded like the wheeze of a broken organ. He'd wanted to be one of the few half-orcs to die out of battle. Oh well, the knife moved so fast. Grumph didn't actually see it fly. One moment he was staring up at impending death in the form of a rat-faced monster. The next he was looking at a rat-faced monster with a knife sticking out of one eye. The beast let out a howl that made all who heard it remember times when they sat in the dark, certain something was moving there, coming after them. The demon twisted to the other side, searching with one eye for the source of its agony. It did not prove difficult to find. "Hey, One Eye. That's a good look for you," called Thistle, twirling the other blade casually in his hand. "Bit uneven though. Want me to get the other one too? Then you won't have to see how ugly you really are." The demon snarled and its clacking grew faster. Whether it understood the words or merely that this small figure had stabbed it in the eye was debatable. What was clear, however, was the effectiveness of Thistle's strategy. Immediately, the demon changed targets. Grumph all but forgotten as it moved toward the gnome. Grumph felt the bottom of his half-orc stomach drop away as realization hit him. Yes, there were better ways to die, but there were also worse ones. Like watching your only friend be sliced to shreds first. Later, when the blood had dried and the dawn had broken, Gabriel would reflect on how it all happened. She'd face the fact that perhaps this sort of thing had been building in her for years, an inevitable reaction to concealing the life she loved for a duty to the family she had. That would be when she finally faced how much this tribe had meant to her. How she'd loved the way they taught her, hunted with her, and treated her like a capable, functioning person instead of a delicate doll to be loved and protected. All that would come later, though, in that moment when she realized she was watching the indiscriminate slaughter of the weaker goblins. All that existed in her soul was an explosion of incomprehensible fury. There were no thoughts, no fears, no debates, only action. With a primordial scream that none would have believed came from her, Gabriel gripped the axe at her side and charged forward. It should have been too heavy, her inexperience too much to overcome, yet none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the sight of those demons' claws tearing through unprotected goblin flesh. To its credit, the demon did look up when it heard her undisguised charge. Had it been a mindless killer, it would have shifted its attention to the new target. These, however, were thinking demons, so it paid almost no heed to the thin woman with the oversized axe. It raised one claw in a purely obligatory blocking maneuver and went back to skewering. Goblins. The error of that strategy sank in right around the time it heard a heavy object hit the dirt, looked down, and realized it was its own claw, along with a sizable portion of its arm. The axe had cleaved straight through its tough flesh and bones, so quickly that the pain hadn't even registered yet. It did an instant later, however, and the demon screeched shrilly at the loss of its limb. "Don't touch my fucking tribe," Gabriel screamed. Back, twirling the axe back to a ready position. She swung again, approaching its now unprotected right side to go for its head. The demon didn't take her lightly this time, extending its remaining arm at awkward angles to block the blade with its claw. They danced like this for countless moments, Gabriel possessing righteous rage, and the demon using honed battle instincts. It seemed a stalemate, but it soon became clear that wasn't the case. With each swing, the axe felt a little heavier in her hands. The ache in her muscles grew more pronounced. She'd gotten its arm, but she wasn't certain she'd get another chance like that. Still, Gabriel pressed on because, while she kept it occupied, the children and non-warrior goblins slipped past, making their way to safety and freedom. Then, with only 10 or so left, she swung too far, overextended, and the demon capitalized with a deep slice. Across her stomach, Gabriel stumbled back, bringing the weapon up to a defensive position, but only barely. Intense pain from her wound was filling her mind, trying to choke out the anger that had fueled her so far in the battle. From the amount of blood pouring onto her tunic, she suspected that soon she'd be too weak to even stand, let alone keep attacking. Seemed this was as far as she could go. The demon thought so too. It snarled in what one could presume was joy, lurching forward a step and preparing to finish the job. With a swift motion, it tried to raise its claw for the killing blow, only to find the appendage unwilling to move. Neither it nor Gabriel could quite believe what they were seeing. All of the remaining goblins had, upon seeing Gabriel injured, changed direction. They rushed forward, all thoughts of self-preservation cast aside, leaping onto the demon's remaining arm. And weighing it down, the monster tried once more to lift it, only to find that the goblins, who couldn't find a place to grab its arm, had latched onto other goblins in an effort to increase the weight. The demon let out a rasp of frustration. Gabrielle, on the other hand, took a deep breath. She blocked out the pain and focused on the anger. She looked at the goblin corpses that surrounded her, listened to the screams of others dying behind them, and imagined how many of her people had heard that damn clacking as their final memory on this plane. Her rage built upon itself, a fire rekindled until she could stay still not a moment longer. This charge was somehow clumsier than before, not to mention shorter given her proximity to the demon. It snarled and tried to raise its arm for defense, only to find the goblins clutching tighter than ever. The awkward bird feet attempted to shuffle backwards, however, their sheer power left little dexterity with which to reorient in battle. Before it had any other chance to react, Gabrielle was upon it. Her axe moved so quickly that a soft whistle penetrated the carnage-filled night air, a single sound of beauty amid the turmoil. The only thing more pleasing to her ears was the audible thump of the demon's head as it landed on the ground. She surveyed her work with a deep sense of satisfaction and turned to the goblins, who were now untangling themselves from a demon corpse. "Hurry and go." It should be S. Gabrielle's next words were lost as the tremendous physical exertion and blood loss struck. Without so much as a staggered step to stop herself, Gabrielle collapsed in the dirt, mere inches away from the remains of the demon. The battle with the demon by the storage building was still going poorly, despite more goblins stepping in to help. It was simply too strong and resistant to their weaponry. They'd managed to push it back, moving it toward the building from which it had emerged, but the effort had cost them several goblin lives. One of the warriors, midway through stepping over another goblin's corpse to take its place, had the very ungoblin-like thought about the futility of this. He would die soon and another would take his place, as had always been the goblin way, but they were dying so quickly. What would happen if they ran out of goblins? That thought plagued him as he struck the monster with his weapon, barely impacting the beast's thick hide. He tried aiming for a vital spot, such as the throat or the eyes, but the demon was protective of those areas, knocking blows away. The efforts weren't helped by the noticeable size difference between the demon and the goblins. With one desperate effort, this warrior leapt up and thrust the blade of his polearm toward the eye of the demon. Its claw swept the weapon away effortlessly, sending the goblin sprawling on his back. He looked upward, waiting for the end to come. Because of this vantage point, he was the only one not to see the dark shape dart out from the building and swing a short sword into the monster's back. He did, however, hear the ear-splitting screech of pain it let out. Moments later, taking advantage of the distraction, he rolled away, grabbed another polearm, and retook his position. The demon turned to search for the attacker, but it found only empty buildings and darkness. Never once to ignore an opportunity, the goblin struck while its back was turned, managing to gauge a few bits of flesh from its hide. With a clacking of claws, the demon turned back around, cutting down any goblins it could reach. The figure stepped out of the shadows once more, padding up to it in near silence and delivering another blow. The goblins didn't know why these strikes were hurting the demon so much more than theirs, nor did they care. This time, when the demon whipped about, it stayed that way for several seconds, allowing the goblins to open up more wounds across its back. Eventually, it turned around and renewed the attack, though it was clear that its focus was split. The stranger came again, but this time, after the strike, the demon jerked its claw behind its back without turning, missing the man while still snagging his dark cloak. As the material came away, the goblins saw it was the male human prisoner they'd taken earlier that day. Now more visible, he retreated slowly, blade close to his body to block the impending claws. As the demon turned, the goblin warrior saw an opening. One of his fellow polearm wielders had torn away some flesh on the torso, exposing a pair of misshapen ribs. Without a moment to think, the goblin repeated his earlier attempt. Only this time, he aimed his thrust between those ribs. He struck true, and the former weakness of their weaponry became an immediate strength. Because the polearm was designed for smaller creatures, both the blade and shaft slid through the ribs. The warrior kept pushing as hard as he could until he felt his weapon strike a solid mass somewhere in the demon's chest. What he'd struck was open to debate, however its effects were quite apparent. With a blood-spewing grunt, the demon wobbled and collapsed, 3 inches of polearm shaft still poking out from its ribs. For good measure, and because you can't trust demons, the other goblins immediately took off its head. As for the warrior who'd struck the killing blow, he picked up another discarded polearm and headed off to find more demons. That was the goblin way. Thistle had never much focused on how he'd die. A gnome born like he was with no talent for magic meant he'd had to accept his mortality very early on. It was only cleverness and the support of good friends that had kept him alive this long, and now it seemed he would be killed aiding one of those very same friends. Thistle had never thought much about how he would die, but this seemed like a pretty good way to go, all things considered. The demon advanced slowly, wary of the knife still dancing in Thistle's hand. For all the broken bits of his body, Thistle's hand had always been shockingly nimble. Truthfully, he credited luck or the gods for that last throw. He was talented, but that had been spectacular. Thistle moved back slowly and carefully. It wouldn't do much good if he died before Grumph had a chance to pull himself up and escape. Though curious to check on his friend, Thistle didn't dare turn away from the approaching monster. This was why he didn't see Grumph making the strange gestures with his hand, nor hear him muttering something in his deep, half-forked voice. There are precious few things that can draw the attention of a demon that has just had a dagger planted in its eye. But one of them, it turned out, was a freezing blast of ice magic striking it in the back. The cold was so intense that, for a moment, Thistle's teeth tried to chatter, even being several feet away from the impact. The demon whirled around and Thistle couldn't help but look, too. Sure enough, still slumped over, a swirl of blue magical energy dissipating off his fingers like fog in the sun, Grumph was looking at the demon with an expression of triumph. Thistle didn't even have time to wonder what had his friend so happy as the demon immediately charged. That made it clear. The big idiot was trying to save Thistle while Thistle had been trying to save him. The futility of it all would have made Thistle stamp his misshapen foot if there'd been time. The gnome's brain kicked into high gear, immediately assessing the situation. He had no hope of getting between the half-orc and the demon in time. The monster's back was to him, so another eye shot was out of the question, and he doubted verbal taunts would draw its ire more than the ice spell had. Since he was out of any practical options, all that remained was banking on the impossible. Grumble, he prayed, lifting up his remaining blade and taking aim at the moving demon's spine. Though I know I am not actively henching right now, I would still dearly appreciate any assistance you'd be willing to give. A strange tinkling sound like bells he'd known in childhood filled his ears, and Thistle let the dagger fly. It struck the demon square in the back, though it did not sink in and sever the spine as Thistle had hoped. Instead, it continued onward, carving through the demon's bones and flesh, and exploding out the other side in a shower of muscle and blood. The goblin knife had somehow left a hole in the demon's chest so large that Thistle and Grumph were able to make eye contact through it. The demon fell down dead, and the knife clattered to the ground some feet away, tendrils of white smoke rising off it. For a moment, there was only silence between the two, neither one certain of what to say in such a strange situation. Then a cheer went up from the center of the camp as the goblins killed the final demon. The outpouring of elation was enough to loosen Thistle's tongue just a bit. I might need to buy some of these daggers before we go, he commented, moving toward the blade that was finally beginning to cease smoking. That is some fine craftsmanship if I've ever seen it. Grumph snorted in agreement, then set about the cumbersome task of getting himself off the ground. 8. It was several hours before the chaos finally gave way to some semblance of organization. The warrior goblins conducted a thorough sweep of the perimeter, ensuring no other demons were waiting to ambush them once their guard was down. Non-warriors and children were brought back into camp and immediately herded to the most fortified buildings still standing. The fires were put out, and the corpses of the fallen were gathered in a previously empty building. The reason it had been empty, evidently, was that it was used exactly for occasions like this. The adventuring party had regrouped quickly, Eric and Grumph spying each other across the sea of short heads. Thistle was still with Grumph, a bloody dagger tucked securely in his boot. Finding Gabrielle had been more difficult. They searched for some time, trying to communicate with the goblins through cross-species charades. Thankfully, one of the non-warriors finally took their meaning and led them into a tent near the center of camp. Cots dotted the landscape, all filled with beings that had sustained considerable wounds. Most were goblins, however. On the largest bed lay Gabrielle. Several goblins were tending to her, removing her bandages, applying a green salve, and reapplying new bandages. Others were checking her for a fever and giving her water. As her friends watched the treatment, one of the goblins noticed the poorly plugged hole on Grumph's shoulder and motioned him over. After a few minutes, Grumph had been properly tended to as well. Gabrielle's treatment, sadly, was not so easy. Although they wanted to stay by her side, it soon became apparent that being in the medical tent was hindering more than helping. So, with heavy hearts, the three walked out into the camp, found some unoccupied space, and pulled out their bedrolls. It was certainly possible they'd be recaptured in their sleep, but none of them could hold on to such concerns as the weight of a stressful night came crashing down upon them. Within a minute of lying down, all three were sleeping soundly. Thistle knew he was dreaming as soon as he opened his eyes. In part, it was because he felt entirely lucid, so much so that he could piece together the impossibility of passing out in a goblin camp and awakening in a church. The other part, however, was because he knew this church very well, and he knew with certainty that if he was here and no one was yelling at him, then it must certainly be a dream. Carefully, Thistle pulled himself up from the pew where he'd been lying. It was all the same as he remembered. Same large ceiling causing a breeze, same enchanted glass windows swirling with ever-changing colors, and same dusty rug running up to the pulpit. That was when Thistle realized that something had changed. Instead of a glowing orb surrounded by mist, the symbol of Mythingol, the gnome god, there was a picture of a broom with a dagger tied to the top. This was the symbol of Grumble, god of the minions. Thistle had no sooner reached this revelation than he saw a male kobold, at least male if Thistle correctly recalled how to interpret the number of spines atop their head, hop up onto the pulpit from the front pew. He was scaly and orange, though the bits around his knees and elbows were starting to look ashen. His lizard's head was wide, yet when it paused to flash a smile, Thistle found it oddly comforting. The kobold walked to the front, but didn't take a place behind the altar. Instead, he moved in front of it and looked directly at Thistle, underwhelmed. "It's okay if you are." "I get that a lot." "No, nothing like that," Thistle told him, just surprised. "It's not often one dreams of meeting their god. This is a dream, but I think we both know it's not just happening in your head," Grumble informed him. "I've come to have a talk with you. Forgive my foreboding, but those words rarely mean good things, coming from deities." "Well, I guess you're not wrong," Grumble agreed. "I've come to discuss something, and whether it's good or bad will be up to you. This is about the knife, isn't it?" Grumble shook his head. "No, this is about the prayer you said right before you threw the knife. I'm not the most popular god in the pantheon. I'm the first to admit it. But I get my fair share of prayers. Please don't let the master beat me tonight is a big one. Right up there with, please don't let these adventurers find my hiding spot. Yours, though, that was a rarity. One of my worshippers charging into danger rather than scrambling away from it, and all to save a friend. Your faith does teach the importance of looking out for one another." Thistle said. Grumble hopped down from the pulpit and landed on the dusty rug. He'd have been shorter than a normal gnome, but Thistle's crooked body left him eye level with his deity. "It does teach that, but you went above and beyond. What you did was brave and selfless, and dare I say, noble." Comprehension dropped on Thistle like Grumph after too many shots of dwarven whiskey. "Oh no, 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 no way. Look at me, you know this doesn't work. I'll admit, you're not exactly what most gods look for, but I don't get a lot of options from my following. Besides, technically speaking, I don't have to ask, you know." Grumble walked forward until he was only a few paces away from Thistle. "I can just give you the calling, and then it's there, and you're stuck with it. Aye, you could do that, but I don't think you will," Thistle ventured. "And why is that?" "Because you're the god of the minions, those who are already shoved around and controlled by the powerful. If you were the kind of god who did that, you'd never have chosen us to look over in the first place." Grumble gave a brief nod. "You caught me. I don't force this on anyone. If you tell me your final answer is no, then I'll let it be. You can consider what happened with the dagger a divine boon and go on your way. My final answer is dot. Double quotes." Thistle kept mouthing words, but found his voice no longer functioned. "You could at least hear me out," Grumble said. "That would be the polite thing to do." Thistle gave no response. However, he did close his mouth and cease his attempts to talk. Good enough. Anyway, there are perks to what I'm offering. Increased strength, a significant bump in endurance, and the ability to bless weapons. Not quite as extreme as you saw tonight, but still impressive. Plus, there are the non-combat boons, some divine magic, prayer priority when calling your god, and of course, healing. Grumble leaned forward on the word healing, so close that Thistle could feel the breath from his snout. If you have something to say, please just say it, Thistle urged, glad to hear his voice had returned. The woman who was with you, she's not long for this world, and Grumph will only be a few days behind her. Demon claws are nasty things. The damage they do gets in the blood, rots the body from the inside out. Herbs and time won't save them. They need healing magic, the kind powered by a divine backer. That's your deal? Do what you want, or you let my friends die. Thistle, I'm not the one who attacked them. I didn't unleash those demons. Honestly, if not for your prayer, I never would have known about any of this, Grumble said. His voice surprisingly gentle. I'm not trying to bully you. I'm offering a way to save them, something you wouldn't have any other way to do. Without this conversation, they'd have just died, and that would be the end of it. I'm trying to help. I'll grant you that, Thistle said after a moment's consideration. But it hasn't escaped my notice that you're helping in a way that gets you what you want. I am still a god, after all. There's a certain way these things are done. All right. Then you win. I'll do it, on one condition. Thistle paused for the barest of instants. Myoria, your wife, Thistle nodded. As long as serving you won't put me in a place where I can't see her in the afterlife, I'm in. My word is given. When your time and my service is done, I will ensure your spirit is reunited with your wife's. Thistle felt a surge of power, one that rippled out from his god and seemed to pulse all around them. One thing you could say about gods, they always kept their promises. They were bound by them. So, how do I do this? You just promise to serve me, and then you wake up, Grumble explained. I promise to serve you, Thistle promptly replied. Really, that's it? I mean, I don't get many of these, and I thought you'd put a little more theatricality into it, Grumble. Well, grumbled. Thistle choked back a sigh, which was the warning sign of a sarcastic retort. He was going to be working with this deity for some time. It would serve them both better to keep things civil. Oh, mighty Grumble, god of minions and henchmen, overseer of them who keep the world running yet remain overlooked, I pledge myself to your service and swear to uphold your standards while glorifying your name. Much better, Grumble said with a smile. Welcome to my service, Thistle, the paladin, when the gnome re-entered the tent. Flanked on either side by a bewildered human and a half-orc whose bandages were now removed, the goblins were a touch confused. When he jostled his way to the side of Gabrielle, moving others aside politely but firmly, they grew concerned. It was only when he pressed his hands on her stomach and the dim glow of golden light began emanating from them that they put everything together. At their capture, the goblins had assumed these folks were searching for a quest, looking to become adventurers, yet not strong enough to actually go by the title. Once the light faded and Gabrielle's eyes flickered open, there was no doubt left. In the battle, something had changed. One of them, at least, had become a true adventurer. Despite the divine patch job, it was several more hours before Gabrielle was cleared by the goblins' medical team and allowed to join her friends. She found them at one of the few tables not destroyed in the previous evening's chaos, eating a few bits of jerky and large amounts of fruit. Pull up a seat, Eric welcomed, motioning her over. There wasn't much meat that survived the fire, but a big gathering party rounded up plenty of apples and berries this afternoon. Gabrielle nodded and sat down next to Eric. He looked different somehow. It took a moment for her to realize that he'd yet to redon his armor. How many Years had it been since she'd seen him sans reflective protection. It seemed to have done him good. His back was straighter, and the usual pained expression was nowhere to be seen on his face. Not to pester, but I wanted to make sure of something, Thistle said as Gabrielle piled her plate full of various fruits. I assume they didn't send a runner this morning? Definitely not, she confirmed. After last night, they aren't ready to take on a band of adventurers. They need time to rebuild and refortify. Besides, they said it didn't seem right, keeping us after we help them. As far as they're concerned, we're free to go. Good, Thistle said, nodding his head. I'd already chatted with them and gotten that story. But I just wanted to make sure they told you the same thing. Gabrielle's hand froze, a fistful of grapes suspended midway to her mouth. The Thistle, you don't speak. Goblik, correction. I didn't speak Goblik, Thistle said. Technically, I still don't. Everything they say sounds to me like it's being said in the proper kingdom language. Presumably, they hear my responses in proper, as if I'd said them in Goblik. That's impossible, Gabrielle pointed out. Not really. It makes ample sense. Goblins are one of the most frequent races used as minions. And as such, they are devout worshippers of Grumble, it seems. Perfectly fitting that a paladin of Grumble should be able to speak with them. You're not a, I am, Thistle said, cutting her off. Unlikely as it sounds, I assure you I am. Presumably, they told you about your miraculous healing? Yes, but I just assumed they were mistaken, and some other traveler had done it. We all sort of looked the same to them, Gabrielle replied. It was me. For better or worse, last night changed a few things, I think it. Best we discuss those, and alter our plans as needed before moving beyond this point. Goblins don't talk much with travelers, but in a few days we'll reach Appleram up the road. Whatever identities we introduce ourselves as there will then be set in stone, because changing them could end with us coming out as frauds. I see, Gabrielle said, finally moving the grapes to her mouth and crunching into them, setting aside the how of your paladin. Hood, it means that you're now a better candidate to play the part than Eric. To be fair, I was never all that good of a candidate to begin with, Eric admitted. I was just the one who owned armor. And I suppose I'll need to get myself a set of that before we reach Solium, Thistle said, pulling out a quill and parchment and jotting a few things down. Then who plays the rogue? Gabriel asked. From what the goblins tell me, it seems Eric was quite nimble last night, darting in and out of battle, hiding in the shadows. Thistle's quill moved deftly and precisely even as he spoke. Gabriel raised an eyebrow at Eric, who turned his attention to his food and blushed slightly. Clumsy Eric did that. I don't really know how, Eric mumbled, moving his berries around his plate. Everyone else just sort of seemed to be moving slower. I guess I'm used to being weighed down, and when I wasn't, I felt fast. You didn't just feel fast. You were fast, Thistle corrected. Fast, stealthy, and deadly. Just like one would expect a rogue to be. Eric's blush deepened. I don't know why my sword works so much better than everyone else's. It's an old hand-me-down. A hand-me-down from your father, Thistle probed. Well, I didn't get it from my mother. That might account for it. Paladin weapons are usually blessed. It's possible the one he passed down to you had such magic on it. Demons loathe blessed weapons, Thistle explained. A rogue with a blessed sword? Gabriel chuckled. What will they think of next? I dare say I might be able to answer that question, Thistle told her. Grumph, if you please. Grumph gave a grunt and pulled the spell book from his pouch, setting it on the table in front of Gabriel. Oh, good. I'd worried we lost that, Gabriel remarked. He reached forward to take her book. However, Grumph put a thick finger on top, rendering it difficult to move. Gabby, were you able to cast any of the spells from that book yesterday? Thistle asked. No, I didn't get much time to look at it before we were attacked. Do you think you could have? Maybe. They were tough, but I could have probably gotten through at least one with enough time to practice. Grumph has cast 3 of them, 1 last night and 2 this afternoon while we waited for you, Thistle informed her. Gabriel's eyes went up as she stared across the table at the stoic half-orc. It wasn't that she thought Grumph to be stupid. It was just, who'd ever heard of a half-orc wizard? If you want to try and play the part, it's only fair that we give you some time to practice, Thistle continued. No, Grumph should be the wizard, Gabriel said immediately, as soon as she'd realized what Thistle was telling her. It became obvious. The one most likely to pull off a role should be the one it was given to. Their task was too important for any other strategy to be considered. If he casts 3 spells with less than a day to read that thing, he's better suited to it. The only issue is that now we're short a barbarian. That's not what the goblins told Thistle, Eric interjected, his own shyness fading now that he was no longer the subject of discussion. It seems you swing a good axe, Thistle added. No, that was just one of those things. I like this tribe, and seeing them get killed set me off. It was closer to a tantrum than bravery. As someone who has traveled with a barbarian before, I assure you, the capacity to turn fury into blood is almost the entire prerequisite checklist, Thistle told her. Forgive my lingering doubt, Gabriel said. I'll do it, because everyone has roles that fit them better. I'm just saying, don't lean on me during a real fight. Concerns have been noted, Thistle said. He could have pushed her harder, but he felt like she was more likely to come around on her own if given time. Now, the better strategy was to pull back and let the idea marinate.